I think you're going to see some tools and things on the carrier capacity and rate side, like Nate mentioned, that are going to be, I mean, exponentially better than what we have probably within 1 to 3 years from where we're at now, just seeing kind of what they're working on and where some of these things are. So really excited. And to be honest, like also very scared. Like I think about it a lot because I think this is going to shift a lot of industries in a way that we just nobody knows and nobody can expect or predict.
Welcome into another episode of Everything is Logistics, a podcast for the thinkers in freight. We are proudly presented by SPI Logistics, and I am your host, Blythe Brumleve. Today, we've got an awesome show for you. We've got two guests that are joining us from the Freight360 podcast and also the creators of the Freight Broker Basics course, and that is Nate Cross and Ben Kowalski. So we're going to be talking all about freight broker training, content marketing, and how to fit it all into your daily jobs and managing it all, within reasonable expectations. So, Nate and Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Blythe. It's good to be here.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Now, this is Ben. You've been on the show before. Nate, this is your first time on the show, and I don't, typically do two guests on a show at a time. But I'm hoping that I can, ask both of these questions to both of you, or all of these questions to both of you. And I would like to know originally, how did you guys meet? How did you guys start working together?
It's actually an interesting story, Nate. You want to go?
Yeah, it is a good story. So. What, about 10 years ago? I think
give or take.
It was probably 2015, 2016, around that time. Yep. I was working at another brokerage. I actually tried to recruit Ben to leave his brokerage and come work for mine. Didn't happen, but we stayed in touch over the years. And then I had started a podcast in 2019 called The Midnight Freight Broker. And I left the company I was at, went to the company I'm with now, and COVID hit. A lot of people started consuming content differently. Podcasts got big. Luckily, I already had one. Ben came on a couple of times just as another expert in the industry. And I feel like it was more so Ben being like, hey, let's do something with this. Let's actually make it into a legit thing where we, do it continuously. So we rebranded to Freight360 in 2020, right? Probably summertime of 2020.
Yep.
And started doing the show, and we've been doing it every week ever since. And it's evolved way beyond that ever since to include other types of video content, blogs, etc. But that's kind of the origin story. Is tried to recruit Ben, stayed in touch, and then we just joined forces.
I think what's always interesting about that, where I really like that story, is because, we teach people how to prospect, and again, what is prospecting? It's just calling people you've never met and just trying to connect to be able to get to know them, make friends, make acquaintances, right? I've always viewed it very similar to what you do as a politician. That's all you're really doing, trying to connect with people, talk, get them to know, like, and trust you, right? And that one or two conversations we had a long time ago, right, goes to show how effective Nate was at that, right? Because that's what I picked up on. And I still to this day remember being on the phone with him and making a mental note, yeah, it's not going to work now, but he hustles, he knows his shit, pardon my French, but understands how to connect and how to do this quickly. And I'm I could tell he's good at what he does. I didn't need to really ask him many questions because he conveyed that confidence so quickly that we just connected real quick. I remember putting a note in my phone and just made a mental note, keep in touch with him at some point down the line. There's probably going to be an opportunity to work together. And I just kept that in the back of my mind. And then when I left the big box brokerage to kind of wait out my non-compete, I went into consulting specifically, and then noticed Nate's show was going. And I was I really want to be back involved in logistics. And I kind of had to wait out a little bit of time frame. So it was a perfect opportunity to get exposure, be tied back into the market for, my wait out period, if you will. And again, Nate and I just kind of looked at it and saw what we could do with it, and just kind of started building it and, consistently moving ahead week after week, doing the things that we'll talk about in this episode, content and whatnot, and all the things that go along with that.
Now, do you remember sort of those early light bulb moments? Was it was it COVID, or was it, the conversations that you were having initially that said, I need to not only start the podcast, but keep it going?
So yeah, I'll answer that. So I was doing it when I left the company I was with before. I ended up just doing it by myself at home during the COVID shutdown. And I would be like, all right, how much content can I get through talking by myself on a podcast once a week? And then when Ben had reached out and was like, hey, what do you think about me coming on and we'll do a episode on, fill in the blank, whatever it was. I was like, hell yeah. I was like, somebody to join me, so I'm not just talking alone this whole time. So we did it, and I was like, hey, let's do it again next week. And then eventually it was like, you just want to do this whole thing together and keep it going. And as soon as we started doing it together, and Ben, I think it was probably your first time podcasting, within a couple of weeks, you got more comfortable, finding your voice in the podcast space versus, cold calling. It's very different ways of communicating.
Yes.
But eventually we got really good at it. The content got really robust and good. And it was much more like long form instead of like a 20-minute podcast. We bang out like 45, 50 minutes. And, now we've had episodes that go well over an hour if we've got a good guest and just really good content. Or we'll do like a 2 or 3 part series on something. So I think when him and I started doing it together, the light bulb went on in my head, like, definitely got to do this as a group instead of just having someone on as a guest periodically, because I think the two of us together, the synergy, it's like that whole, what you can do together. It was that synergy, right? What you do together is, greater than the output of your individual. You know what I'm talking about, right? But like,
if you want to go far, go together. If you want to go fast, go alone, right?
Mm.
And I also think it's the dynamic, right? Like, we have very different personalities. And Nate, I think, is much more detail oriented and focuses on things in a way that I just don't have that propensity. Like, my personality, I think, is different in that way, right? So why I think it always worked early on and got better was because we have very different perspectives on the same job. Nate primarily manages lots of agents and a lot of the clerical back end and a lot of the very procedural standard operating procedures that I follow and teach. But like, Nate lives in that world. I lived in the world of customer relationships, negotiating the moving of the freight. Nate had a much different perspective on the same position. So we were able to talk through one topic from different points of view. So we're never competing for each other, right? For attention, because they're very different perspectives that complement each other, which is, I think, why it worked very early on and why it's continued to work.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I do a monthly show called Freight Friends with Grace Sharkey, and being able to play off of each other takes a little bit of time. But now I feel like we've hit a really good groove where I know where her strengths are and she knows where my strengths are. We kind of complement, each other when it comes to the weaknesses aspect. But I'm curious as to how long did it take you to sort of figure out what strengths each of you should, because a podcast is a lot of work in addition to your full-time job. So how did you sort of balance out those initial responsibilities of who's going to take care of what?
Even to this day, the podcast, because remember, I was running the podcast for like 6 or 9 months before Ben came on and we rebranded it. So I got really, really good at very quickly being able to record, edit, and release with very minimal work or
so lift. You do all of it.
So naturally when Ben came on, I just kind of kept doing that. Yep. And it's extremely, even to this point, from getting it recorded, processed, edited, put out an audio and video, any kind of After Effects, thumbnail, it's an hour at most. So it's very little amount of additional work for me to do that. And I based on when we record each week, I kind of work those little things in during my downtime at my regular job. Whereas Ben, I think as far as other stuff that we do, Ben has been very good with relationship development with folks that we get involved with, whether it's affiliate or sponsorship or just connections that can get us boosted to the next level, kind of leveraging someone else's network to try and get us more viewership and all of that stuff. So we've kind of just naturally gone into the areas that we I think
That's
have our
interesting.
strengths in. Not to say that one of us doesn't fill in for the other one either, because that always happens too. But it just kind of naturally went in that direction.
Yeah. And I think, again, to just add, like early on, I listen to a lot of podcasts. So like I really enjoy the medium. I spend probably at least, I'm guessing 15 to probably 30 hours a week, right? Listening to some audio content, either a book or a podcast. So a lot of the big names that most people are familiar with, like, Tim Ferriss, Huberman podcast, those groups, Peter Attia, but also, I don't know if anyone or if you've heard of like My First Million, like I followed that newsletter from when it started, listened to the podcast. So I tracked what was working for them. And when Nate and I hooked up, like I didn't want to say like I had a roadmap, but I had their roadmap. And a lot of that was, well, this is working. We're in a niche. We can own this niche. Let's just do what is working for other people, right? So early on, he focused a lot on the audio. I did a lot of deep dives into YouTube, what was functioning, research, what works, what doesn't work, a lot of those things. And I kind of spent a lot of my time on the video side as we got that off the ground. He spent a lot of time on that side of things. And that was really our first year until we were able to leverage some larger relationships with DAT and things. And they came back to us for the course. And then it became more narrow, I guess, the focus. Like we worked with Lean at the time, and our strategy was really, we want to be the educational source for the industry for every fundamental thing you need to learn in your first year to 3 years, right? Because that's really what we felt was missing, whether we're working with a new agent or somebody that's just coming into the industry. Like we just see what they're running into all day. So to create the content, it was like a flywheel, right? Like I'm working with a client, or Nate was working with an agent. They're running into the same problems. And then Nate and I would get together like, what do you run into this week? Well, everybody's having an issue with this. There's our topic, because it's already top of mind. And I also felt like the best thing about this, and what I like most, the podcast as well as like coaching or consulting, is that like I feel like the best way to improve in anything is to teach it, right? No matter what that is. So for me to have to work to articulate things better, to be better understood by different people with different learning experiences, this show gave me a very good, repetitive every single week to practice changing the way I say things, right? Like I think everybody, when you do something for a long time, you forget what people know and don't know, and when you learned what. So we're constantly being able to be grounded back at the beginner level or intermediate and sometimes experience level, where they're running into, where their issues are. That's really where a lot of our content comes from, is just kind of boots on the ground experience, things that we run into on a daily or weekly basis. And the industry kind of works the same for the most part. So what he's running into, I'm running into usually, whether it's a tight market or a loose market. And that's really why we haven't had to spend a ton of time developing an outline for what we're going to talk about. Like we're really going to talk about whatever that issue is people are running into, because we're running into it as well.
Are you in freight sales with a book of business looking for a new home? Or perhaps you're a freight agent in need of a better partnership? These are the kinds of conversations we're exploring in our podcast interview series called The Freight Agent Trenches, sponsored by SPI Logistics. Now, I can tell you all day that SPI is one of the most successful logistics firms in North America who helps their agents with back office operations such as admin, finance, IT, and sales, but I would much rather you hear it directly from SPI's freight agents themselves. And what better way to do that than by listening to the experienced freight agents tell their stories behind the how and the why they joined SPI. Hit the freight agent link in our show notes to listen to these conversations, or if you're ready to make the jump, visit spi3pl.com. And so it sounds like that this is almost like market research for you guys, or your own experience as market research. Then you're conveying that through your podcast, and then it's turning into additional opportunities where you can almost study yourself as an athlete. Study other creators, other broadcasters, and how they approach it, and then use that same insight to your point, Ben, to then reframe how you speak to your prospects. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Right. And again, to the same point of like COVID, right, too, what was happening at the same time was like everybody goes home. And I mean, I'll just speak for myself. Like I spent my entire professional life in sales floors, like surrounded with that energy, that culture. Like there is a difference to doing any type of sales in that environment versus in your home, right? So for me, I felt a huge absence of that when it was gone. And this was a great way for him and I to stay connected with lots of people in the industry very frequently, both as, a show, but also people reaching back out to us, telling us what they're running into. Hey, what you talked about, like we're running into this. So it was also a great way for us to kind of intentionally create as close as we could to the environment that we used to be in, even though we're no longer in it, which I thought was like a huge benefit.
I'll add to that too. I think it was like Mark Cuban saying like, you don't get rich without a little bit of luck in there, but there was a bit of luck on the timing of all of it, because you think about people that are leaving the bullpen, right? They're leaving that sales office environment for an extended period of time. They don't get that mentorship or advisement or training or guidance that they would get from a peer or a supervisor in person. So they started relying on content on YouTube and on podcasts and all that stuff. So we just happened to we already had kind of the runway launched. And then as our content just kept, we did more and more and more content. We had people that had ears that wanted to listen to us because they weren't getting it anywhere else and they needed it. So and there's also this thing in the freight world where a lot of companies, and I've literally seen this argued in depositions before that I've taken place, and they say, our training material is proprietary. And it's like, how? It's like basic sales stuff. Like, how is it proprietary? So anyway, like, everyone holds their training like close to the chest in freight brokerage, saying that it's some secret sauce. And we're like, well, it's not really. Like, a lot of these basic principles are all the same. So our goal was like, let's just have transparent education that's accessible to everybody in our industry. And we'll continue to add content to that. The reality is, for every, 1,000 people that listen to your content, how many people actually take action and follow what you tell them to do? It's like probably less than 1%. So it's not like we're giving away the farm or anything, but at least the timing was good, and we were able to create an environment where to this day, people use our content to train their new employees. It's amazing to see that we've been able to get to that level.
That's awesome. Let's actually, dive a little bit deeper into the Freight Broker Basics course. What was the moment that you decided, okay, this is something that we should actually tackle? Was it, working with Dad, or was it seeing some of the numbers from YouTube? What was that? How did you make that logical next step?
So yeah, it was actually, we had been in contact with DAT for a while, built a pretty good relationship, and they kind of had the idea. They're like, we have all these people getting into freight brokerage, because remember, the post-COVID shutdowns, everybody was trying to get into trucking and brokerage because there was so much freight to move and a lot of just chaos. They're like, we have all these people asking for education and we don't have a solution for them. And they're like, do you guys think that you could put something together and we can kind of code spearhead this thing? And so that was kind of their idea. And like, I've seen a bunch of courses that have been out there for years, and the reality is they're either outdated or created and taught by someone that's either not still in the industry or never was in the industry. So the credibility is lacking. So it's kind of a mix of, there just wasn't a lot out there, and DAT had a need, and we had a good relationship and rapport with them that we're like, yeah, let's do it. But remember, we both have full-time jobs. So it wasn't like we could just stop working for 3 weeks and bang out the content. It took us, like 6 months to get everything like full.
It took a very long time.
It was a very, very long time to do it.
I would say it was definitely 6 to 8 months. And it was very much like, I could imagine what it would be like to write a book. I mean, we had to outline it. We went through every course we could find, audit it, bought every one that was available, went through every single one we could find, wrote down what they all had, what we felt they were mostly missing, and where we felt we could improve. So we had everything that everyone else's course. And then we were like, what is missing from all of them? And it was mostly sales stuff and a lot of like what you really do day to day. Like it was all like high overview. Like, oh, you'll call a shipper, get a load, and you book a truck. And then Nate and I are looking at each other like, if you gave this to me, like I couldn't do that. Like that's not enough information. Like there's so many steps in between here. So again, a lot of this was just me and him writing it out, coming up with the topics, sharing it back and forth, and then sending it to other people we know in the industry to audit it for us and say, hey, what else are we missing? So, DAT was a great resource. A lot of other folks that we've worked with, Kevin Hill and other people in the industry that have been able to lend a hand and look at it and give us, their thoughts to build this out like really as robust as we could, so that if we were going to put our name on this, right, and spend this time, we wanted to make sure it was at least comprehensive and it did what we said it was going to do, like teach you literally how to broker freight, not teach you what a freight broker does, teach you how to do it. And those are very different things that I think what separates our course from other courses.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, I would imagine for a lot of those people who are making those courses, they don't have that firsthand knowledge that you guys already have and working with industry experts. Because I've actually, Ben, I had you on my previous podcast, and we were talking about courses that were, or I brought it up, so I'll put my name onto that. But some of them were straight up scams. There was one woman in particular that reached out to me that she took a freight broker course with the promise at the end of the course that she would be able to join as an agent under that MC and operate. And they just left her high and dry. They never offered. She paid thousands of dollars for this course that she didn't really have, hoping that it would lead to a job. And then it turns out it was just, she just took some, YouTube videos and watched those. And that was the extent of her training. So it was one of those things where it's like, wow, how often is some of these scammy tactics being played out within our industry, and I think it's probably a fairly high number.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like I remember when we went through to, like Ben said, we went through and audited the existing courses, because you have to know who your competition is, right? So we went and figured out what's out there, and I remember reading one of the like lessons that this guy's course had, and it was so outdated that it said that the surety bond requirement was $10,000 when it had been $75,000 for like 7 years at that point. So like it was outdated by almost a decade. And I didn't even bother going through the rest of he had like a big section on like regulations and like governing bodies. And I'm like, that stuff changes like so fast. And I think not to pivot, but like, TIA, right? They're a great partner of ours as well. And Ben and I, along with Chris Jolly, we teach their new broker training now, and their new broker coaching sessions. So what we did is when Ann Ranke came in, we got to meet her very early on in her time with TIA. They had a big push on like, hey, we want like this education piece to be tight knit, ironclad, and like legitimate. So they had us go through and audit their existing course and then become the instructors for it. So we created with Chris Jolly, a new curriculum, which has again, since then evolved a second time to stay up with with the times and make sure it's as robust as possible. But it goes to show that, someone as reputable as TIA and DAT, they're going to want to make sure they've got relevant, good content out there where just any Joe Schmo could be like, oh yeah, freight broker course, come give me $2,000 and I'll guarantee you can make 6 figures a year. And it's like, well, no, the content is what it is, but the way that you actually teach it, present it, and keep it up to date is going to be a big game changer as well. And Ben, we talk about it a lot with people, is like set expectations, right? You can't just watch a video and expect stuff's going to happen, right? You've got to take the actual information there, go and apply it. And more likely than not, you probably have to consume that content upwards of 10 to 15 times over a period of a year or so for it to really sink in, and you have to put the reps in for it to become comfortable as well. So there is a lot of junk courses out there. I think ours is obviously, we created it in conjunction with DAT. I think it's great. TIA's very reputable organization, and we help teach that as well. But outside of that, I've yet to come across like a really good, stellar, like commercially available training program that's not like internal to a company. So a lot of scam options out there.
And I'm curious, why don't you think that more companies create their own internal course? I mean, just thinking of it from a logistics standpoint, it would be much more efficient to create a course, once or twice, once every few years, and have your new employees take that versus just, trusting that somebody within the company is going to train them right. Is there any reason why most companies, or do most companies, have their own internal training around just the basics of a freight broker?
Yeah. Go ahead, Ben, because you worked at a big box. So give us.
I was going to say, like, the bigger companies definitely have a more standardized version and do have, I would say, like, kind of close to this. Like, I worked at TQL. I've gone through theirs. Like, they have a robust, and again, I went through that 8-9 years ago, and it was pretty good then, right? And again, and comparable to any of the courses that are just available, like theirs was much better, right? And I, had a vivid memory of that when we wrote ours, as to like, oh, these bigger companies are doing this a little bit differently, right? And what they focus on. And again, they need somebody to do the job, because if they put someone through the course and they can't do it, they got no benefit. They just spent a whole bunch of time for nothing. So they have an invested interest in the outcome in a way that people selling a course, I don't think, do. And again, I've had the opportunity to work with all of the larger brokerages and go through a lot of their training. And like, again, in that, I would say there's a difference. And again, there's a reason why they have longer non-competes and why they protect the employees that they are training to do this. It costs a lot of money for these bigger companies to do that, for sure. But when you get off of the very big, large cap brokerages, most of the small caps for sure don't do this, because it just takes a lot of time, right?
Exactly.
Again, Nate and I have jobs where I'm brokering or Nate's running a brokerage. It took us 8 months to do this, 2 of us, right? And I remember like mostly 12-hour days, like 8 hours at my normal job, 3-4 hours work on this after work. Like, there aren't a lot of managers or owners of smaller brokerages that have that additional bandwidth or time, because they've got freight to move and customers to deal with, right? The middle-sized companies, I think you see a little bit of it, but again, there tends to be so many more urgent things that hit their to-do list every day that this just always ends up getting moved down. And when I talk to owners that use our course for this purpose, which is another reason, like that's why they get access to it and why it renews every year, because they use this to train their employees, because it's a great starting point. And I've always said, like, look, hey, you can spend 6 to 8 months to do this yourself, use ours, and then add the other stuff that we missed that you want your team to know. And at least you don't have to start from zero, right? Like, you can get the fundamentals, use something that is readily available at a pretty low cost point, and then add anything you want to do on top of it. And I think that's why the mid-sized companies and smaller companies don't really often build this from the ground up. And again, even when they build it, you got to update it, right? The same thing that Nate and I are saying. So like some of the other companies I know that have done this, they did it 4 or 5 years ago. And they're like, yeah, it really needs updated. How we vet carriers changed, all the frauds changed things. And it's like, well, who's got the time to go do this? So then it just always, again, moves down the priority list until maybe they get to it, maybe they don't.
I think so. Like when I worked for a trucking company before I got into brokerage. When I got into brokerage, I had to learn the 3PL side of it. And I went to a company that at the time was like $40 or $50 million a year. And they actually had like a corporate trainer, right? A guy whose sole job was to train new people and keep our content up to date. But even that, like he himself couldn't do like train everybody and keep the stuff up to date. There was outdated stuff. I think the training manual that I had when I started was like 10 or 12 years old. And I was like, oh gosh. And they would tell me like, oh yeah, this has changed since this was written. But it just takes a lot of work. And the vast majority of brokerages are smaller than that. So they're not going to have the manpower or the cash flow to pay somebody to be like your education person. So I think that's why the majority of brokerages don't have their own internal training, because they don't have the time, they don't have the money. They're just kind of bootstrapping it and doing it that way. Whereas like Ben said, TQL, CH Robinson, Echoes, right? They're massive. They have big standardized training curriculum, and they likely have a large amount of people that are either in charge of teaching or creating or both when it comes to their educational content. And they value that. They keep it close to the chest, and they consider it proprietary.
Brokering success demands a battle-ready strategy. TIE TMS equips freight brokers with the ultimate battle station for conquering a tough market. With TIE, brokers gain access to a comprehensive platform where rate intelligence and quote history converge on a single screen. It's not just a page, it's a strategic command center designed to help brokers win. TIE equips your team with all of the data they need to negotiate with confidence and allows them to communicate directly with carriers and customers from a simple control base. Revolutionize the way your brokers perform by giving them a competitive advantage with TIE TMS. For more info, go to tai-software.com/battle stations, and we also have a link for you in the show notes to sign up for a demo. And so when you're thinking about this course and thinking about updating it throughout the year or throughout the years, what are some of those, I guess, big problems that new freight brokers are facing now that is more up to date as far as like a training perspective versus even just a few years ago?
Well, I mean, I think the problems tend to be somewhat similar. To give you like a specific example, we've done a lot of content lately on fraud, right? Because fraud didn't exist in the caliber that it does today if you go back 10 years. Like double brokering was a thing. We talk about it in our course, but we had to create a lot of additional content afterward about identifying fraudulent, illegal brokerage activity, double brokers, identity theft, all of that stuff. Because the issues and a lot of the solutions and tools now didn't exist 5 years ago. So that's a prime example. Another one though that was around before but has changed is market fluctuation. So, we would tend to see ebb and flow of the market, let's say every 18 to 24 months, whereas we've seen this elongated market cycle that started over 4 years ago and still hasn't come full circle yet, right? Like we went from when post-pandemic, when it boomed in like about 4 years ago, and then about 2 years later, it dipped off. It still hasn't come back full circle. So a lot of it is, it's just, we taught it, there's content out there about market fluctuation and how to handle it, but it's more so on a smaller level than what we're seeing now. So we've had a lot of content on, hey, this elongated market downturn, here's how you can prospect, effectively in this market. It's not going anywhere quickly. It'll change eventually. It always does, but we're going to be here for a little while. So you have to adjust and make content in that arena.
And I think that's a really big one. I'll just elaborate a little more on, right, is most of the folks that came into our industry and the big wave during COVID, right? If you think about it, there's always the different market cycles. I just look at it very simply, right? When you have a peak of a market, it's very hard to find trucks and rates are very high, right? And the bottom of a market, trucks are easy to find and rates are low, right? So when it's hard to find trucks, service trumps rate most of the time because shippers still need to move things and it's important they get there. So they don't have the ability to pay any less than they want to. You got to pay what it costs because that's what a truck's going to cost. And the market we're in now, it's price over service, at least for the time being, right? So what we've seen are lots of folks that came in the peak of the market during the pandemic, which also lasted the longest peak market ever, right? They're used to picking up a phone and any shipper that answered was like, hey, we'll onboard you. If you can get us a truck, we'll work with you. That was the bar because everybody needed trucks, and a shipper that might have traditionally only worked with a handful of brokers would onboard 20 or 30 because they just couldn't get the capacity. So anybody that could, they were willing to, right? So again, you end up with habits from folks that came in that like, anybody I call will do business with me. It's all great if you can find a carrier. Now we're in the exact opposite of like, shippers don't have a lot of urgent needs. You have to find a way to add value that isn't as obvious as I can find you a truck, right? Maybe it's service, maybe it's how they invoice, maybe it's how you communicate, like whatever nuance is important to that shipper, you have to uncover those in this market now. That is a world of difference from the way it operated when a lot of folks came into it. So a lot of our clients and a lot of people coming to us are like we were killing it. Everybody was doing great. We had 15 salespeople. Now we're down to 6 and nobody can seem to bring in a customer. And then when we are asking more questions, we're finding like they're approaching their prospects as if it's the same market with the same expectations of if I call somebody and they don't work with me, I go to the next one. Well, in this market, you've got to talk to a shipper maybe 6 to 12 times over 2 or 3 months before they'll give you a shot to work with their freight. As opposed to 3 years ago, one phone call, they're going to send you lanes to quote. So it's a completely different environment. Like I look at it as like the context of the sport you're playing in, right? There's like different rules. You're playing a different sport. Like that might've been like traditional NFL. And this is like arena, football where like it's a different sport because it's got a different size field and you've got to do different things to be able to succeed. So I would say like that are larger shifts. And
what's funny too, Ben, you mentioned all of that. Out of all the courses that we looked at before we created our outline on our curriculum, I didn't see a single one that ever talked about market fluctuation, even like the predictable stuff, like, for example, produce, right? Produce has cyclical nature depending on what you're moving, when you're moving it, and where it's moving out of. Hurricane season, right? You guys both live in Florida, like that every single year come September, right? It's hurricane season. It's extremely predictable. The severity of it might change, but it's coming every single year. And I didn't see that content anywhere in any of those courses before. Whereas now with our content and what we teach for the TIA, we talk about market fluctuations. We talk about selling in a hot market versus a cold market, and then in that transitioning phase from one side to the other. So yeah, it's crazy for sure.
I was going to say, when you're teaching at TIA, I would imagine that you're teaching a variety. Are they live courses, or is it the same course maybe just repackaged for them?
So that's live. They have like a web-based learning, and then they go through coaching sessions with us. So there's, I think, what do we have, 12 total coaching sessions, and Ben and I do half of them.
Correct. So it's a structured curriculum that happened. I think we're doing trimesters now, right, Nate? Like we used to be quarterly. Now I think we do it like.
No, it's quarterly now because it's 12.
Okay, quarterly.
It's 12. Yeah. It used to be trimesters.
The class comes in, it goes for a full quarter. There's an outline curriculum that we worked with them and Chris Jolly, to outline what are the things you need to know to be able to really operate in the industry now. So there's a set list of topics, and then every week, either Chris or us, I think it's every week, right, Nate?
Every week, yeah.
Yeah, they're sitting in a class, and it's either us or him teaching it, and then we have our topics, and we get to allow them to ask questions. So it's a very engaged type of coaching, right? Like I call it like the Socratic method. Like, so we're asking questions to engage them, not lecturing them as if like, you need to learn this, read this. It's more like, what are you experiencing, and getting them to share so that we can take the lesson and articulate in a way that is relevant to where they're at in their journey, right? Which I think is also different, right? I think Nate and I both have this, right? Like it's like first principle understandings. I think lots of companies and lots of training go like, just do this because you're supposed to, right? Like book a load, pay the least amount of money, and that's it. And Nate and I approached this more from like, okay, but like, why and what are the things that play into that negotiation, right? Like the shipper rate, the weight of the load, right, for instance, and like how those things affect what you're doing so that people get a foundational understanding of the industry, not just a whole lot of tasks that they need to execute every day. Because to me, like that's not teaching somebody how to fish. That's just getting somebody to follow directions. We want people to learn and understand to be able to do this themselves, which I think is also very different.
Do you find that because if I'm reading between the lines, it sounds like a lot of the troubles or challenges that brokers are experiencing right now is the same, whether you're new or experienced.
Yes. Yep.
Very much
Correct.
the same.
And
Market
again,
fluctuations affect everybody, no matter their status.
They're all still working the same market, right? So they're running into the same playing field, to keep the analogy, right? Like everybody's still playing the same field, right? I think what is different in your experience level is just the problems you face, right? If you're running a book of business and you personally got 8 people on your team and you're moving 200 loads a week, like your issues are usually more like, how do you create the space to prospect more, right? To be able to do those things. For somebody newer, it's more usually accountability and making sure they're doing enough of the right things to get them where they want to go when they expect to get there, right? So I would say fundamentally they are doing the same things, but there's usually a different impediment to them being able to execute that thing is what differentiates them.
I'm curious as to what does, because I used to work at an asset-based brokerage, but that was years ago. And I do wonder, what does a typical day look like for a freight broker from the moment they get into the office to when they know it's okay to leave? What does that process look like for them? Is it mostly software dominated now? Is it pounding the phones? Is it both?
I think it really depends on a couple things. Number one, how, where are you in your journey? Are you brand new, or are you, have you been there for 3 years or 5 years? And the other part is, what is your role? Are you running your own brokerage? Are you just a sales rep? Are you a cradle to grave broker that does sales and operations? Are you just a carrier rep? It really depends. And it's fun. We just did an episode that came out 5 days ago or 4 days ago on what is the average day or week of a freight broker. And we talked through it. No day is the same, but there's a lot of consistency that involves putting out flyers in the morning, talking with customers, prospecting, booking trucks in the afternoon, putting out flyers as they come up, and setting up your stuff for the next day. That's kind of like your super watered down generalization of it. But depending on where you are, if you're brand new, you're going to spend way more time prospecting and following up and generating leads versus booking trucks, putting out fires, because you don't have any fires to put out if you're brand new. Whereas if you've been doing it for 10 years, you're very likely not the one putting out all the fires. You got someone else doing that. You might just be working on building relationships with existing customers, trying to find some new big whales and fish out there. It just really depends, but a lot of it is repetitive and cyclical, but at the same time, no day is exactly the same because you never know what's going to come your way.
What are some of those fires look like that you're putting out every day?
Truck shows up late, truck breaks down, you get scammed on something, bad weather. Ben, I mean, there's a million.
I would say a lot of, I think, your more common ones too, right? And Nate touched on it. It's like a lot of it's just covering trucks or recovering loads, right? Because if your customer is very price sensitive, right, you then have less money to work with to pay the carriers, right? You do what you can to be able to pay them as much as you can to make it work. But again, if I've got only a certain amount of money to work with, and that's on the lower end for this load, there's a very high likelihood this carrier is going to find a better load before my load picks up, which increases the amount of times I've got to put another truck on the same load. So that is one of the larger fires in this type of market that everyone runs into, is just rebooking the same loads. Like I was talking with a client actually right before this, they track this metric and they want it to be like closer to like 8-to-1, and they're seeing it like 5-to-1, meaning like for every 5 booked loads that the truck picks up, 1 recovery, right? And they want that closer to 8. So those are some of the things they're trying to track, because this is one of the more common fires. That one in fraud, because it takes you longer to vet a carrier now to make sure they are who they are, is another one. And again, just unexpected things, meaning like you spend all of your time to be able to create the demand for yourself and your services. That's all prospecting is, right? And then once you're effective at it, now you got to keep doing that thing, but be able to adjust as your customer has a need, because your shippers, by definition, to use a brokerage, it's usually an unexpected load they need help with. Either their truck didn't show up, or they got an additional shipment that they didn't expect in the middle of the day. So that email comes to you at 2:30 in the afternoon. Maybe you plan to prospect, but it makes no sense to not capitalize on the opportunities that take you forever to get. So you've got to be able to pivot, jump to that, be responsive and resilient to your customer, let them know you're always on top of it. And then you got to be able to pivot right back to prospecting, because that's a big issue with most brokers, is like, it's not easy for any human to switch tasks constantly. Like multitasking is a huge efficiency killer in most professions, but inherent to the way our job functions, like you have to be able to be good at it. But you have to be able to switch back too, right? Like you can't just be hitting at the loudest thing that is most urgent and never the most important. And to your question earlier, like experienced brokers, this is where they need the most help, because they're always jumping at the most urgent thing. So what they end up doing is never getting to prospect, because you're never going to have somebody walk over to you or call you and yell at you and go, "Did you make your prospecting calls?" Like that's you, right? So like those are the things that always get pushed down the to-do list or to tomorrow, day after day. And the more experienced brokers end up in a position they don't want to be in. They lose a big customer or something because they weren't doing that consistently, right? So again, like it's creating that space or the habits and showing them how to improve on these things so that they can get to the thing that's most important to their business, not just what's most important to the customer when the customer needs it, right? And I'd say like that is the big difference on like fires between early on and like later on in your career.
Are there any AI tools that have sort of entered into, maybe it's a TMS or, just an independent tool that can be plugged into a TMS or, WMS, or pick your software, that you've seen that looks really promising to help brokers manage some of those, I guess, sort of low value tasks?
The thing that comes to mind for me, Ben, is Levity. I mean, so Levity is a company that, so Tilo is the co-founder. He's been on our podcast before, and I believe Freight Caviar as well, but they've been around for a handful of years. And I think they're kind of taking like the, hey, we're not changing the game and bringing something new. We're going to, like you just said, some of those, low efficiency tasks, we're going to help you automate those. So like it'll read your email, be able to go run a rate through DAT or green screen or whatever, build a load in your TMS for you, things like that. But outside of them, I feel like AI is a huge opportunity right now in our industry. And I think it being that the AI boom really started like a year and a half ago. I want to say like when ChatGPT became like open for anybody to use. That's when it like just kind of went nuts. I haven't seen it like fully. I haven't seen anyone just come in and be like, boom, here's an awesome product. It's going to change the way we do everything. I think it's slowly starting to evolve in there. Like I'm definitely seeing with DAT, some of their like predictive rates that they rolled out last year. That's a pretty cool tool. I'm not sure if that would be considered AI or not, but I don't know. Ben, what do you got? You're like more in tune with the AI stuff than me.
Yeah, I think there's a lot. Levity is a really cool product that helps you really. It goes back to what we were saying earlier, like the fire, right? If I'm prospecting and my customer needs something, I need my customer to realize or to believe that I am always on top of it, right? But I also have this other thing to do. What I really liked about Levity is like if you've got customers that tend to send requests like throughout the day and you want to get them a quick response and almost buy yourself time to work on it, Levity is great because it integrates with the TMS and your emails, so it can respond to your customer while you're prospecting, and then you can jump on it after. So it works really well for customers that have like very consistent messages in some ways. Like I just think of like lumber as an example. They'll send out load lists every day, a few times a day on lanes they need help. Levity is a great tool because it will respond to my customer in the way I want it to without me having to stop what I'm doing, buys me time to finish what I'm doing than to work on that. And again, there's more functionality beyond that, but that is another tool that again helps us not have to be as reactive and allows us to be a little more intentional, which I really like about it. A few other products that are out there, I know that they're being worked on and we're keeping an eye on. We definitely don't want to announce them, but like I've seen a couple of tools that are working on like negotiating, like chatbots that will negotiate rates on behalf of carrier teams. I've seen those improve a little bit. There's one company in that space that's doing pretty well with that. And I think you're going to see some tools and things on the carrier capacity and rate side, like Nate mentioned, that are going to be, I mean, exponentially better than what we have probably within 1 to 3 years from where we're at now, just seeing kind of what they're working on and where some of these things are. So really excited. And to be honest, like also very scared. Like I think about it a lot because I think this is going to shift a lot of industries in a way that we just nobody knows and nobody can expect or predict. And I don't know what that's going to look like. So there's a fear a little bit, but I'm like, well, I'd rather move towards the fear and be on the front edge of it because there will be winners and there will be losers. And I at least want to give myself, my team, and the people I work with as many of these advantages to be in the group with the highest likelihood of succeeding. Because I think just like when the internet came along 35 years ago, right? Early adopters had huge wins, right? Over the ones that waited to get on board. And that could be the difference between your business being around and not being around 3 to 5 years from now. So to me, like it's very important. I don't think it's necessarily impacting day to day so significantly right now, but I read something, I don't know, it was Elon or somebody put it out. It was a chart showing like the exponential improvement in AI technology. And it's like a factor of 10 or 100 on top of what tech improves every year. And I can't remember the ratio that tech improves every year. Like there's that number that they came out in like the 60s that it gets this much better every year.
Is it like double every year, right? Is it like chip capacity or I don't know. I'm not like a tech nerd, but
anyway, AI, to that point is supposed to be like a factor of like 10 or 100 compared to that and how quickly it's improving year over year. So, I mean, I would be surprised if it didn't have significant changes to our industry somewhere in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And it feels, with ChatGPT just storming onto the scene and just using it, I use it now every day within, and I find a new way to use it all the time. The app is fantastic. I'm using it more than Google search now. And I'm, it's able to give me, very like nuance, and nuance at times, of course. It still has hallucinations, but it's able to give me a much more clearer answer. And I'm able to take, for example, like a podcast transcript and upload it to it and say, what are some of, give me 10 or 15 of the most powerful quotes from this conversation. And it's able to spit those out in seconds. And so a part of it is like, wow, this is really powerful. But then on the flip side, it's one of those things where it's like, is this going to be able to replace me one day? Like there is that level of fear that's involved as well. But I'm right there with you, Ben. I think that you have to experiment with these tools, even if they are a little scary, because and this is a quote that I heard recently that I fully believe is that, AI won't necessarily replace your job, but a person using AI will. And
Yes.
I think that it's going to just have, it's had a massive impact on just my small marketing team and with the content we're able to distribute and create. And I hope that I'm not as replaceable, but I think, it's an interesting sort of argument or an interesting internal debate around your own ego around it. Am I actually, better than AI? Can I be better than AI? And I think that that's maybe a good thing to sort of pursue, is to try to be that better version of yourself.
For sure. Moore's law doubles every 1.5 years.
There it is.
Ah, nice. Nicely done.
So I'll add in too on the AI piece. The meeting assistants, so the ones that plug into your Zoom meetings, your Teams meetings, and they get because you were mentioning Blythe, the transcript and be able to do stuff. The ones that'll give you, Ben, I forget the one that you use all the time.
There's Otter, there's Fathom.
Otter. Yep. Yeah.
I use Otter.
I told us about it, right? So Otter, Ben and I will be in a meeting and it'll spit out bullet points, to-do list, all the action items, full transcript if you want it. It's really cool. Even so with the podcast too, which is cool, is we upload our, I edit the audio real quick, throw it up on Buzzsprout, and then it'll create chapters. It'll give a description if you want, help you give a title. It's really, really cool how it's gone in the content space. Freight brokers though, and I'm going to full-heartedly agree with you on this. I think the negotiation piece is going to be really interesting to see how that pans out in the coming years. I saw an Instagram clip the other day that claimed it was a AI voice talking to a driver or a dispatcher on the phone trying to who was calling in about a rate or about an available load, but the capacity thing. And we won't say too much about it, but I'm with you. 1 to 3 years, I think you're going to see some big new players in that space who people have probably never even heard of right now. No.
And they're using that now. Again, I don't want to go on a tangent, but I know they're using AI chatbots to make what we would have called robocalls back in the day. So telemarketers that have very structured scripts where this objection gets this response, they're using that right now for fundraising things. They record the best salespeople, all the responses, all the objections, and it literally just executes based on what it's hearing. So it's using the human voice of the better salespeople, and it's just literally able to have this conversation because they're very repetitive. They tend to have the same patterns. So it's definitely being used in other sales industries for sure now. Yeah. I think ours is a little more nuanced, and I think it's going to be a steeper hill to climb, but we'll see what the future holds for sure.
Well, we just talked about what, sort of the typical day looks like for a freight broker. How do you think AI impacts that at all? I'm imagining that it's going to help with a variety of those functions, but does it fundamentally change what you're doing throughout the day?
I don't think it fundamentally changes. I think a lot of the mundane tasks will be made more efficient, and it'll create a lot more time and opportunity for relationship building, business development, probably to run a leaner admin support team so you can grow without having to hire as many extra bodies. I think it'll kind of assist companies and brokers in that way. But I think fundamentally, we're still going to be, we're logisticians. We solve logistics problems for our customers. Until the way that freight is transported changes drastically, I don't see that, or massive regulation overall. I don't see the average conceptual fundamental tasks that we do changing too much. Ben, what do you think?
I think it's more to what you had said earlier, right? It's more of the person with the tool, not instead of the person. So again, Nate's example, the way I look at it, I'm hey, if I normally would need to hire 6 or 8 people to cover my loads for me to sell, right? And maybe I only need 2 or 3, right? Same thing in like coding. Like, again, I know that some of the tools that are out there with AI that assist code, like coders, like I've read reports that say like, a B grade coder can now operate like an A grade coder with the tool because it's helping them find their errors faster and giving them suggestions. So they're learning quicker. They get feedback faster, right? I think you'll probably see something similar to that as it becomes adopted within our industry. Again, whether it's negotiating, check calls, or whatever the tedious manual task that normally is, to be honest, like entry-level people mostly fill these positions in our industry, right? So I think you'll probably just see a lesser need for those people. And also those people don't tend to stay very long either. Like they'll come in, they tend to turn over within a year and go somewhere else. So I don't see it as necessarily replacing people. I just see it as becoming more effective and more efficient in some ways to allow us to do more with less resources.
Yeah,
I've seen the same thing in warehouses, right? Like I read a report because a lot of this robotics and things and AI are being used in warehousing within our industries, right? Whether it's stocking shelves, staging a truck with pallets to get it ready before that truck arrives. There was a really good article, or it was a good podcast. Someone who was being interviewed that owns like a large portfolio of warehouse. And he goes, listen, like we have 100% turnover in our warehouses. He's like, not like hyperbole, not like almost 100, meaning every year, he's like, I've been in this industry for 20 years. He goes, we don't have one employee in 5 of our warehouses that has been there longer than a year. Nobody wants the job. People take it until they don't need it anymore, or they can find something better and they leave. So we have huge costs of training people for jobs that nobody really wants anyway. He's like, everyone's yelling at me saying I want robotics to replace people. But like, if I could get people, I wouldn't have wanted the robotics. He's like, I'm trying to solve a problem that is created from the fact that nobody really wants this job to begin with. Now, I think that could be a slippery slope and who knows where that leads to. But at the very least, I think early on, that's what it's likely to play out. But who knows?
Yeah, it's one of those things. I think it's something, there's a lot of fuss that's made about warehouse robotics and how it's replacing jobs. But also, with autonomous trucks as well. And I think for a lot of folks, they've slowly come to the realization that you were worried about the wrong careers that were going to be replaced very soon, because it's very challenging to replace those, the almost the blue collar workforce. It's more of the white collar workforce that is going to be impacted much more quickly than the in-house workers. And even then, to your point about warehouse robotics, it's something like more than 90% of all the warehouses across the country use no form of robotics whatsoever. And there's a real issue. Like Amazon is actually really genuinely worried that they are going to run out of people to hire for their warehouses because they have so much churn. And so it's a fascinating just sort of debate around, AI and how you define AI and how it fits into each of these different roles. But, I'm just a big fan of you, especially for small business owners or small teams, being able to, these tools feel like a great equalizer versus some of the bigger companies that have the budget for, a 20-person marketing team or a 20-person, 50-person sales team, where you can use some of these tools and really almost put your workforce on steroids. Go ahead.
I was just going to say to that point, right, to like circle back on something we had said either in the green room or early on, right? Like, how are we using these tools now to create more time or space, right? And again, like, I think we're all on the same page. At least I know we've talked about this offline. It's like, we're not using AI to create our content by any means, right? I think there's we could talk for an hour on what's happening to the environment and the SEO with just content that's generated through AI tools that they're just regurgitating other things. That's all it does, right? So like, it's not expanding, it's not creating novel thoughts, it's just regurgitating things. And again, like, whole other side topic, but what we use this for, right, is like, I think it's incredibly valuable for me to kind of get started when I'm by myself sometimes, right? Like, you're kind of at this space where it's like, they call it writer's block, where you're like, I got a couple ideas, I don't really know how to get the momentum. And I'll just be like, hey, suggest an intro or like write me a script on this. And I'll look at it and I'm like, yeah, like that doesn't feel right. But I'm like, this little piece right here seems like a good starting point. And then you can just start writing. And again, like it's not to replace, at least I don't view it as a way to replace what I'm doing. I'm like, this just is a person that I can use when I need to, that can help me also spell check, that can help me look at my grammar, that I'll sometimes throw a whole script in for YouTube or whatever and go like, edit this and suggest another format, and I'll see what it takes out and go, oh yeah, like this didn't really make a lot of sense there. That was like a tangent. We can move that. So I think it does help us get better at the things we're doing. I hope there's more of that and less of people just outsourcing it directly and going, whatever, looks good enough, send it. Because I think that has big unintended consequences.
The AI is definitely at a place right now too, where you can spot if something was purely written by AI, and the images too. Like, that's an AI generated image. So like, for example, I have never in my life ever used the word delve. And if you ever ask ChatGPT to write something, it's going to say, let's delve into, and I'm like, I would never talk like that. Right. But I've gotten newsletters and I've seen emails where I'm like, that's 100% ChatGPT. And it's not even like GPT-4. It's 3.5, the free one, because they won't even pay $20 a month. And they're sending this crap out. So, but as stuff evolves down the road, it's probably going to be hard to identify what's what. And I do think, like, for these people that just write mass email blast to shippers, like it could get to a point where you could say like, hey, write me 100 unique, emails that cover these 10 bullet points and, make it right. But either way, maybe something like that could help somebody create an email campaign for like on a marketing side. But I don't know. I'm curious to see where it goes. I think that the human being, there's a thirst for human connection. And I think that true business development happens through that channel of communication versus, AI to try and win something over. So
I think it was Paul Graham, who's a VC investor type. He tweeted out a graph the other day or a couple weeks ago, I think, that tracked the word delve. And the massive amount of increase of that word being used is directly correlated.
That's an actual thing, right? It's like a GPT like
It
favorite word
is.
or something.
It's the correlation with like when GPT launched versus that word being used. It's like up and dramatically to the right. So to y'all's point, it really is. It's one of those things where you have to. It's still a human is required during most of the marketing process. I am curious because we have talked about prospecting a lot during this conversation. And if you were to, advise a new freight broker on balancing the skills that they need to learn with some of these AI tools, what would be some of those suggestions that you would take when it comes to prospecting?
On the tools to what aspect of prospecting? I guess like lead generation or like in general?
I guess maybe I'll pose the question this way. How would you, if you were to hire a new freight broker right now, what would be the most important aspects of prospecting that you would teach them?
I would say Ben and I, we have a pretty consistent message on this. And it's number one is to break up lead generation, which is, identifying who these leads are, and then prospecting, which is the actual act of reaching out, whether it's call, email, in-person visit, your follow-ups. But I would say it would be to really hone in on those two things, find a very efficient way to get a lot of leads quickly with very little work, and then make a lot of phone calls. The reality is, if somebody's brand new and has never made a cold call, they're going to suck at it at first, way more likely than not. And it takes, I would say it probably takes 200 to 300 calls before you even like find your own voice and feel comfortable doing it. Because every time before then you're like, this feels so awkward. I just can't wait to get off the phone. The person on the other end of the phone, they hate me. They're so mad that I'm calling them. It's like, no, that's not the reality of it. Like make 100 calls or 200 calls and you'll realize that like, it's really not that bad. 90% of the time, they don't pick up the phone anyway. But I would say it's, so to recap that, efficiently get a ton of leads easily with minimal effort, and then just go through the repetitions of reaching out, figuring out what your opening is, how you're going to run through your questions of prospecting, identifying the right questions to ask at the right time, and what to say in response to a certain objection. Those are probably your biggest ones. I think the number one reason that brokers don't succeed in the sales side is they're not putting the activity in. It's a numbers game. And if you're not making the calls, number one, it's less opportunity to talk to people. And number two, it's less opportunity for you to refine your skills to effectively communicate. So that would be my answer on that one.
If most of the people that they're calling aren't picking up the phone, how are they getting better at cold calling?
So I would say that if someone doesn't answer the phone, there's another way to get a hold of them, because you might have the wrong number. It might be a phone tree. It might be you have their voicemail. There's crafty ways to get yourself to the right person. And I'm not going to endorse any one of them, but I'll tell you ways that people will do that is they'll be like, all right, I'm going to call the accounting team or the accounting department and ask to be rerouted to this person because I had the wrong extension. Or I'm going to call the sales team, become buddy with them, and then ask to be transferred. Or I'm going to call their boss and who doesn't have time for me, and the boss is going to say, hey, call this person back. There's all kinds of ways to do it. But I did a cold calling blitz about 2 months ago with one of the guys in our brokerage, and we went through, I want to say it was like 50 phone calls in 1 hour. And I think we actually talked to like 6 or 7 people. And out of those 6 or 7 people, only 1 or 2 of them was actually a shipping manager or in the freight department that would act like a traffic manager that would actually tender the loads out. The other ones were like operators or, someone that's just screening phone calls, like your gatekeeper, stuff like that. But the vast majority, no one answered. It's just that simple. So that's why we say 100 calls a day. You're going to spend 2 to 3 hours, 100 calls a day, and you're going to have a very, very few amount of good conversations, but it's a numbers game. Ben, what was your stat? Like over 1,000 phone calls before you got your first customer, something like that?
It was like 2,200, something like that.
2,200,
again, I was in a market similar to this, like 2016. And again, the other thing too is it's anecdotal, but I've never seen anybody put in exactly what Nate said, consistent effort, making the calls and doing it in a way where they're hitting a consistent number, even if it's 60 or 80, right? And maybe not hitting that 100. I've never seen anybody do that day in and day out for a period of at least 5 or 6 months and not end up with customers and succeed in the industry. Every single person I've ever seen not make it didn't make it for one reason. And we always had a joke in management, and this is true in all sales. If you were looking at your underperformers and results by money, you could almost always directly correlate it back with the activity on their phone. The guy making the least or the gal making the least made the least amount of calls. The person making the most always makes the most calls, right? And yeah, there's nuance and subjectivity to how and what they're saying, what we work on in coaching and things. But the reality is if that's not true, the rest doesn't matter, right? I could teach you to be the best basketball shooter in the world, but if you don't take shots, that doesn't do you any good either, right? If you're not going to put yourself in the place where everybody's uncomfortable, you're picking up the phone and calling somebody that didn't expect your phone call. You're taught your entire life to avoid being rude, and that isn't acceptable. And it frustrates you when people do it. So to make somebody do this intentionally is emotional. That hurdle is the hardest thing to get them through. But if you can get them through it and do it consistently, that's by far the biggest fail or win fork in the road, if you will.
And so once you, because I am curious, once you get the person on the phone, what is your advice to keeping them on the phone and listening to you?
Here's the way I kind of break down that approach is that whatever you should say, it needs to get to very quickly what's in it for the person you're calling, not what's in it for you. Most people call and announce who they are and why they're calling and what they can do. The person you just called and interrupted doesn't care about any of that. They don't even care who you are yet. They want to know if it was important enough for them to pay attention to, because they're still doing whatever it was they were when you called them, right? So you need to get very quickly to what's in it for them, whether it's you ship to a location close to them, you've got other trucks that deliver in their area, you've got customers that are in the same niche, whatever that is of value that you're leading with, better be concise and matter to that person enough that they at least stop doing what they're doing, right? And then pay attention to you. That's one first step, right? And then from there, right, you can pivot in different ways based on what you say, but also, right, right after that, you're going to expect an objection. Hey, we're good. We don't need any help. Thanks for calling. So then the next step is they call it going for no. And you literally do that. I would say hey, look, to be honest, like I wasn't expecting to work together. In fact, hell, I don't even know if we'd be a fit to work together if you had a load. I was calling because I thought it might make sense to have a quick chat. Again, this is why I called, and then go into it, right? Because whatever that is, they're never paying attention to you anyway until you at least get that thing first, right? And then if you've got that, then you can at least move towards either a personal thing like, hey, it's Monday. How was your weekend? How's your day shaping up? Getting them to just get into the flow of a conversation. It's at the end of the week. Maybe I'm going to go to personal, like, hey, Thursday, one more and out the door. How's your week shaping up? Got any plans for the weekend, right? I'm trying to talk to them the same way I would anybody that would be a friend or a colleague you would see in person, right? And it's just getting people to understand, like, if you get somebody to talk to you, actually an effective prospecting call is like no statements. There's a statement or two at the beginning of what's in it for you. The rest is me just asking you enough questions to keep you talking about what you care about. That's how I get you to like and trust me, is that people, it's like, what is everybody, the sweetest sound to everybody is their own name. And everybody likes to teach and talk about things they know. I want to ask just enough questions to get this person I'm calling to be interested and to want to talk to me. A question does that. So it's really the questions far more than the statements or anything you do that gets that person to connect with you.
I want to add into, and we talk about this a lot in our content, is I'm like anti-script. I know some people are very like, here's a script, read off of it. And that's great. If you're brand new and you don't know what else to say, I get it. But I've done this myself, and I still do this myself, is if there's something new that you're trying to sell on or call on, have some sort of bullet points to give you an idea of the things you want to hit on, but don't have it literally written out verbatim. And then have a list of prospecting questions to ask that you can kind of plug in as they're appropriate. And also bullet points on objections. Like Ben, you just mentioned, the conversation should be easy, right? You ask a question, they give you an answer, and then you ask the next question. But if you use a script, your next statement might be extremely way off from what their response was when you from whatever you had asked before. I always think about a prospecting call as like the Goosebumps books. If you guys ever read those when you were younger, was like, all right, if you want to open this door, skip to page 47, right? Like you should have a bunch of options in front of you. So instead of a script, when I was early on, I had like an Excel sheet or printed out on a Word document, just the big items that I wanted to hit on, right? And eventually, like you don't need it anymore. It's all up here in your head, and you just can naturally open up a conversation. And like you, Ben, I always try to open a conversation by just immediately releasing any tension in there, right? Whether it's a joke, I always, football season, I'll make a joke about how my Bills sucked on Sunday or whatever it was. Or in Buffalo, it's June. Of course, we have a blizzard right now. You say something just to relieve the tension and pressure, because you might get a little chuckle out of them. And now you're less nervous or intimidated on the phone. So break the ice, ask questions, build rapport, and I like to keep them short and sweet and have a reason to follow back up. So.
I would add like one more thing to this too. And it was, I think Noah Kagan this was in his recent book. He talked about this, and you've probably heard this at some point, right? Have you ever heard of the coffee challenge that they've ever heard that? So basically, right, like the initial part of a phone call is really just this little dance that all people do when they meet anybody anywhere to determine, does this person have the same values as me, right? You run into somebody at the grocery store, the cashier, wherever, right? That's why you have these tedious conversations about like weather or whatever, right? You're just trying to gauge this person's feeling and whether or not you proceed, right? That's all this really is. And one of my favorite things to do with newer salespeople or even brokers, right, is like, I'll ask them to do this and practice this in their day-to-day lives, because it helps them with this muscle, right? It's one of the reasons why I think like bartenders and servers tend to be very good in sales, because they're just doing this all day, connecting with new people, making small talk, and getting there very quickly. So the coffee challenge is really just to go when next time you buy coffee, you have to ask them for a discount, which no matter what it is, you just, hey, can I get 25% off this cup of coffee? Which is a really awkward thing to ask, and they're going to feel awkward, but it puts you intentionally in the space you're in prospecting that allows you to practice this in another setting And it's literally the same thing you do on the phone, but you have more information because you can see the person. You can read them, hear what their body language, or see what their body language is telling you. So I think those are other great ways to improve on this very specific skill set of connecting with people you've never talked to before.
And then what does the follow-up process look like, which I know can be super intensive, but just, sort of a quick overview of what that process looks like. You've done the hard work of getting the leads, calling them, getting them on the phone, have a conversation with them. Does email play a role? Does LinkedIn play a role? Or maybe a combination of all of those things?
I would say all of the above. I think it depends on how the conversation goes, but I'm personally a huge fan of communicating across multiple different platforms, but more importantly, communicate the way that your prospect wants to be communicated with. So by all means, throw a LinkedIn request, send a thank you email or a follow-up email. If they're open to give you your cell phone number or their cell phone number, I love that, because then you can shoot a text like, hey, you got a quick second? I got a question for you, right? But I think that the takeaway is when you're following up, have a reason to follow up. Don't call and just say, I just wanted to touch base, right? Like that's the dumbest follow-up, because you're wasting their time. But a good reason is, hey, you mentioned this to me on the phone last week, Jim. I looked into it and blah, blah, blah. Something like that. You've got an actual reason to follow up that's adding value to them. Like Ben said a bit ago, was you want to quickly get to a point where there's something in it for them, not for you. And that's a good follow-up is going to have something in it for them.
Yeah, for sure. So, and I think as you get better at this, right, like you tend to leave the last conversation in a way that you can pick up the follow-up in a way that they're not going to remember most of your last conversation, right? They're going to remember how they felt when they talked to you, right? Did they want to avoid you or do they want to engage? And then it's mostly, like Nate said, have something prepared. Do not ever call and be like, hey, just following up. You got any freight for me? Like nobody wants that call. It doesn't add any value to anybody's life. So you would need a specific reason, and you have to work to craft these on like some calls. So that's why your notes in your CRM are incredibly important, because all of the money is in the follow-up. You're not going to get any business unless you can follow up with them at least a half a dozen times or more. And your ability to connect with them in the future is related to how you left the last one, right? And what you're going to ask them when you connect back with them again, for sure.
All right. I know we got to wrap up. So, what one quick question just to sort of, round out the entire conversation. You guys are your experienced agents, brokers, creators within the freight industry. What advice would you give to other folks within the industry on how to balance marketing yourself, your personal brand, in addition to managing a full-time job?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I think for some people, because marketing is such a broad term, I would say if you're trying to do like marketing as far as like on like a social platform or website, I would say just start creating content, whether it's blogs or posts that kind of just shows up, kind of highlights who you are as a person and gives a little bit of the human touch versus for example, LinkedIn, right? Some people, all they do is share articles on there, but then there's a handful, more than a handful now, people in my feed that they tell personal stories. And it's I want to read this stuff. And if I ever needed X, Y, and Z, I'm going to that dude because I feel like I kind of know him and I've never spoken to him. So I would say have some kind of authenticity in how you're sharing information or posting things. But I don't know.
The only thing I would add,
I don't have a good answer for you.
No, and I think that's really, I think what you touched on, right, is one is it should be authentic to you, because we were talking about with any of the LLMs or ChatGPTs or whatever, right? They all kind of sound the same, which means even if it is an effective email or post, right? There's no way for the person reading it to know anything about you other than the information. So it's nothing to do with you. So there's a very low likelihood you connect with them. So I think authentic content is valuable. And I think other marketing, right? We're talking emails and just whatever that is. The message when I'm crafting them is, if I had their job, would I be irritated somebody sent this, or would I appreciate it? And if I would appreciate it, then I know I've got a closer message, right? And the only thing I would add is with marketing, emails specifically, is less is more. people put like these diatribes and these like long essays. And I'm like, I'll ask anybody, I have a client, I'm like, open your email. I'm like, how far into this email would you read before you clicked out of it? If it wasn't somebody you knew, right? And like, oh, a sentence or two, right? So again, how it's even like spaced and how short it is, I think matters a lot, as well as your subject lines. Like it needs to hit home, be short, to the point, and valuable. If it hits those three things, you're adding value and you're helping them connect with you in a way that builds a stronger relationship, because that's the goal at the end of the day, right? It's not being everything to everybody and just posting everywhere that you can do anything that anybody needs, because nobody wants a generalist in anybody they hire. Like if you hire an attorney, you want somebody that is really good at the thing you're hiring them for. If you're hiring a doctor, you want to know the doctor that's really good at what's wrong with you, not the one that can do everything. Same thing in our industry, right? Like stick to your strong suits, try to be specific in a way that shows you can help this person or this industry or this type of shipper with this thing, not that you can do everything they've ever needed. Everybody tells them that. That doesn't differentiate you. So those are the, I guess, the like, I don't know, like kind of first principle things. I think I like the content that I either send to shippers, put on LinkedIn, or even YouTube content for that matter, right? Like if it's not hitting those things, it's just noise.
Well, that is a perfect place to wrap this conversation. Tons of insight, tons of great advice and tips for folks out there, especially who are working in the freight broker role and beyond, just in general, of learning how to market yourself and create content and balance it all. I think we're all trying to figure out how to get a little bit more balance between all of those different things. So Nate and Ben, where can folks follow you, follow more of your work, get a copy of the Freight Broker Basics course?
Yeah, easiest way is our website, freight360.net. You'll see right on the homepage, you can sign up for our twice a week newsletter, which has free content and industry news. It's got our course link on there. You can see the curriculum. You can even see the first lesson for free, just to kind of preview what it's all about and how it's taught, essentially, how it's put out there. And you'll also find there all of our blogs, videos, podcasts. It's out there. We're on YouTube. If you just look Freight360 up, we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, you name it. Our podcast is out there. Just Google Freight360. You'll find us.
Awesome. And I will make sure to put links to all of those things in the show notes just to make it easy for folks. But Nate and Ben, really appreciate your time and your insight and perspective on this episode. I hope folks will find a lot. I think they will. I know that they'll find a lot of value in this episode. So thank you again.
Thanks, Blythe.
Thanks for having us.